Hello everyone and welcome for another Apitherapy video. This time we'll be talking about the very small world of apitherapy. We'll be talking about some microscopic observations, and mainly we'll be talking about bee pollen actually. And this is something that, as a fan of apitherapy, as someone very involved in apitherapy, and also as a beekeeper, that I practice personally quite a bit. Actually, I do harvest my own bee pollen, and I harvest it every single day, then I freeze it, and that's how I deal with the pollen. I do it very frequently. But then what is really interesting is to observe a little bit the plants around you in nature as you're harvesting your pollen. And you just go and pick some of those flowers, bring them back home as you bring your pollen back home, and then you do a couple microscope slides. And you put the pollen from the plants that are blooming at that very moment on some slides. And you do also slides with the pollen that you yourself harvest from your bees, that the bees collect, and then you harvest from your bees. And then if you look at that bee pollen on microscopic level, you will actually find some matches. You'll find a match from, oh, that color of pollen from your bees come actually from that very plant. And sometimes you're not sure of this. Sometimes it's very obvious. There's only one plant in bloom. It's obviously that one. And if you compare the plant itself with the pollen collected by the bees, you'll find the match right away. But sometimes it's a bit tricky. Sometimes it's plants that you would not think they would go to, where they collect the pollen. So if you find those matches, it's very interesting, and it gives you also absolute certainty on the origin of your pollen, on the plant origin of your own pollen. You know exactly which one is which, and then you can actually look up on some literature and found out that some bee pollen have some specific concentrations in some minerals or vitamins, or also even probiotic and so on. So lactic ferments and all this. So if you find that out, you'll know that if I need to boost either that mineral, that vitamin, or that lactic ferment or something in my own system, nutritionally speaking, I should actually aim for that specific type of monofloral bee pollen. And if you can actually find the right match and find out with your microscope what pollen you are actually harvesting from your bees, then you know what you should aim to. And so that's one thing. The second thing is, if you do that, it will connect you so much with the nature surrounding you. This is amazing because you'll know exactly, oh, my bees are actually going on that flower, and you'll know for sure. There's no doubt they go there because that's the pollen they get. Of course, some plants will produce more nectar than pollen. So when the bees go on some types of plants, you won't see much pollen coming from that plant, but you'll see a lot of nectar coming in. And if you know a bit your plants, you'll know that, oh, they collect almost no pollen right now. Well, guess what? The reason is very simple. Not because your bees don't work anymore. It's because they go on plants that collect almost only nectar at that very moment. So yes, there's a drop in your pollen production, but there's a huge amount of nectar, so honey, that will be produced in your hives. And with that kind of observations, you get to know really well the vegetation around you, all the plants, their cycles, when do they bloom, and you see them more, and you get to know your own environment, your own ecosystem really well. And if you do that with multiple sites, you'll notice actually the change of pollen collection from one site to the other. And this is getting just fascinating. Of course, it takes some time, but don't be discouraged by the time it takes, because usually pollen will vary from one main type of pollen. Sometimes there's a couple or 3 or 4 main types of pollen in your bee collected pollen, but that will change, usually the main ones, once every week or second week. So you can do that usually once every 2 weeks some observation and pollen identification, and you get a fairly good idea of what is blooming at what time, and that is really working well. So first interesting point, you get to know what monoflora pollen you can actually use for your own specific nutritional needs. Second interesting point, you get to know really well your surrounding plants, environment, ecosystem. And actually there's a third really cool point with that way of working with the pollen, is you actually get to know how does a microscope work. And a microscope is a pretty delicate instrument. And you might have heard that some instrumentalists, like, you know, a violin player, a cello player, a flute player, and all those great artists, they used to say, and they feel that actually themselves, it's a little bit like if they would have a violin in their own body, let's say. We used to say it's kind of if their own violin or music instrument is actually part of their etheric body. That's what we usually name this. So, but they actually feel it, those instrumentalists. They feel that it's a little bit like their violin is always there, or their flute is always there, or whatever instrument they play, it's kind of in their body somehow. They feel it all the time somehow, and it's really part of them. And it's the same thing for all instruments, basically. Myself, personally, I love astronomy as well as astrology, so I'm used to telescopes, but using now a microscope, it's really interesting because it makes me used to an instrument, a tool that allows me to see in another level, which is microscopic, which is the infinite, small, tiny world. And that is kind of another dimension of the regular world we see. And that is really interesting. I don't know how you like science or not, but if you do love science, well, you probably noticed that it's so fascinating when you find a new tool, a new instrument that allows you to understand life better, that gives you a reading of life that you couldn't get otherwise. And when you get used to such instrument, it's a little bit like those music instruments. They get in your body. You're used to think and to, it's like you want to use your microscope with everything. You feel something, you have, I don't know, any like a headache or any kind of pain or some sort, we're in apitherapy, so let's talk about that kind of thing. And you'll want to see in the very detail, you'll want to have a look on microscopic level, you know, what is really happening inside. And sometimes it helps you having good insights on, you know, like the cause of the cause, you know, of your disease. Very often we say, oh, there's a stress behind that disease or that pain or that headache or something like this. And, you know, that kind of tool is actually training you to feel that, yes, there's a way to find the answer. And this is really cool. And anyway, it might be my own scientific fiber that I'm expressing now, but seriously, using scientific tools like microscopes and so on are great because they really do give you certainty on the fact that yes, you can have the answers that are usually hidden. You could not see on microscopic level without a microscope. It's totally impossible. The slides I'm showing to you in that video, these have been, they're actually 1,000 times bigger than we would actually see them in real life, thanks to that microscope. So anyway, those instruments are just fascinating. So yeah, that's the third really interesting points regarding bee pollen microscopic observation, and that is really fascinating. There's quite a few websites actually talking about that. If you want more information, I'm sure you can find that all on the web. So I just wanted to briefly mention this and the value of it. And if you really love bees and you love nature and so on, and you have bees, well, you should do this. This is so fascinating, so nice to do. So anyway, I do it myself. I love it. And you did have a chance to see a couple of my slides. and you see the differences in pollen. Of course, the color, and when you look at those differences, don't think about the color. The color, there's a colorant that we used in order to show the differences in terms of texture and yeah, the look of the whole pollen samples. So that's why they all look the same. They all have pretty much the same color, but there's a reason, you know, that the pollen I collected was not pink, right? So that's the idea. I just wanted to make sure you get that. Yeah, so you see the differences, mainly the shapes, the sizes. That's what you'll see the most obviously. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and see you another time for another apitherapy video.